In January of 1919, a wave crashed through Boston's North End, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. Though it wasn't a wave of water, but molasses, a popular sweetener at the time and one of the main ingredients in Boston's famous brown bread. So thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video as we take a look at the Great Boston Molasses Flood and make some bread in a can, this time on Tasting History. So when deciding on a recipe for today, I knew I was wading into troubled waters, or troubled molasses as it were, because every Bostonian thinks that their version of brown bread is the version of brown bread. And it seems that this is not a new phenomenon because looking through Boston's cookbooks over the past 130 years, it seems every author kind of scoffed at everyone else's version of brown bread, even though they're all incredibly similar. But I figured the safest course would be to consult that most wicked iconic Boston recipe collection, Fannie Farmer's 1896 Boston Cooking School Cookbook, whose recipe for brown bread calls for 1 cup or 120 grams of rye meal, 1 cup or 140 grams of graham flour. Graham flour is a type of very coarsely ground wheat flour, and it is named after Sylvester Graham, who lives on in the graham cracker. And it's kind of hard to find graham flour today. You can get it online, but if you can't find any, you can just use stone ground wheat flour. You're not going to notice the difference once everything is together. 1 cup or 160 grams of cornmeal. Mind you, that is not corn flour, which is sometimes used today, but cornmeal, which is, like the people of Boston, grittier. 3/4 teaspoon of baking soda, and I can tell you right now that is a lot less than is used in modern recipes, so if you want to double it, if you want something a little bit fluffier, go ahead, but I'm going to stick with what she asks for. 1 teaspoon of salt, 3/4 cup or 180 grams of molasses, 2 cups or 475 milliliters of buttermilk. Now, Ms. Fannie Farmer did prefer her brown bread plain, but a lot of people add walnuts or sometimes raisins or currants, so you can add those, and that is what I, Max Miller, would do if I were not following her recipe. And I mention my name, Max Miller, because it seems that a lot of people who watch this show don't actually know my name. I'm often getting Matt and Mark and Marcus, which seems way off, and today I even got a Max Kellerman, which, okay. But it is Max Miller, which is why I really appreciate today's sponsor, NordVPN, giving me the unique link nordvpn.com/MaxMiller. But more importantly, NordVPN is, in a way, responsible for a lot of the content that you see here on Tasting History, because often when I kind of fall down these research rabbit holes and I'm looking at people's bibliographies and seeing where they got the information, just making sure I'm getting my facts right as I can, often they lead me to websites that are outside of the US, in the UK or Europe or other places in the world that won't let you access them unless you are in that country. But NordVPN will allow me to switch my IP address to match one in that country so I can get access to those sweet, sweet primary sources. NordVPN also provides extra levels of threat protection. So when you are logging into Wi-Fi other than your trusted home Wi-Fi, you can feel secure. Or when you're going on some of those more dodgy websites, you saucy minx. So I only use it for research. And so can you by signing up using my link nordvpn.com/MaxMiller. You will get the best pricing that is currently available along with an extra month plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. nordvpn.com/MaxMiller, which is my name. Now on to the brown bread of Ms. Fannie Farmer. She says to mix and sift dry ingredients, add molasses and milk, stir until well mixed, turn into a well-buttered mold, and steam 3 1/2 hours. The cover should be buttered before being placed on mold and then tied down with string. Otherwise, the bread in rising might force off cover. Mold should never be filled more than 2/3 full. A melon mold or 1-pound baking powder boxes make the most attractive shaped loaves, but a 5-pound lard pail answers the purpose. So it's that last part that I find most intriguing, all the different kinds of molds that she mentions. She talks about a melon mold, which was very popular in her day and was a large mold in the shape of a melon, usually a muskmelon or something that kind of has a ribbing going down the sides. Then she says you could also use a 5-pound lard pail, which is a paint bucket full of pig fat. But she also mentions using a 1-pound baking powder box, which, based on what I could find, looked very similar to the cans that baking powder is often sold in now, but quite a bit larger. And this seems to be the preferred shape of brown bread throughout the years, though usually it was a coffee can, and in my case, cans that were holding pinto beans until yesterday. So get yourself a can or two and then butter them up nice and good, and then prepare your batter. First, sift all 3 flours and then whisk them together with the salt and the baking soda, and then pour in the molasses and the buttermilk and stir everything together until you have a batter. Now immediately the baking soda and the buttermilk will start to react with each other, creating tiny bubbles. That is what is going to give the bread some rise, and as she is using about half as much baking soda as a modern recipe, you don't want to waste any of them bubbles. So get to work right away pouring your batter into the buttered can or cans, and she says to not fill them more than 2/3 of the way full at most, so err on the side of less full than more. Then smooth the top of the batter and put the lid on. And if you're using something that doesn't have a lid, that's okay. You can just use aluminum foil, and I'm actually going to put an extra layer of aluminum foil on mine and then tie a string tightly around it and then kind of crimp the edges. You just don't want any liquid to get inside of the can itself. Then set the can onto a trivet in lightly boiling water and put the lid on and let it steam for 3.5 hours. Now, as I'm splitting mine between 2 cans, it'll probably be done in closer to 2 or 2.5 hours. But I'm going to let it go for the whole time because the nice thing with this bread is you really can't over steam it. Now some recipes today actually have you add some sugar into the recipe to satisfy that modern sweet tooth. But in 1919, the only sweetener most people could afford was molasses because sugar had been rationed for the past few years on account of the war. And so it's fitting that molasses is used in this recipe as it is in so many of Boston's iconic recipes like Boston baked beans. But the molasses that was about to flood the city of Boston was not destined for kitchens, but rather munitions factories. Distilling molasses produces ethanol, which at the time was used in 2 things, rum and explosives, both of which were big business for the Purity Distilling Company of Boston. And in 1915, a couple years before the US entered World War I, they decided to build a massive holding tank right in the city's densely populated north end to store shipments of molasses before sending it on to their refinery in East Cambridge. The massive tank dwarfed everything in the surrounding neighborhood and was set only feet away from the main road. 90 feet wide and 50 feet tall, its shadow loomed over the mostly immigrant residents and businesses near the wharf. It was built to hold 2.5 million gallons of molasses, though actually it was built to be that size, but it clearly wasn't built to actually hold that much molasses. See, when they ordered the tank to be built, they put construction under the guidance of Arthur Gell, a top engineer with an impeccable safety record. No, I'm just kidding. He was a financial advisor who had never built anything in his life and had absolutely zero engineering experience and just wanted to get the job done as quickly and as cheaply as possible. But how could this be, you ask? Was there no oversight, no regulation? Well, not really. There wasn't a lot of regulation in building at the time, and if there was regulation, it was consigned to buildings. But this was not a building, this was a structure. And so they didn't even need a permit to put it up. So with no inspections expected, they didn't need to hire a competent builder when they could just get someone who they know would bring in the project on time and under budget. And Gell did just that. Though even then it wasn't easy because the deadline to have the tank finished was, like my lower back, tight and inflexible, because even before the tank was finished, the company had ordered a massive shipment of molasses to be delivered. But with a few corners cut, Gell had that project finished just as the molasses steamed into Boston Harbor. But as it happened, one of those corners that was cut was that of safety testing. So instead of filling it up with 50 feet of water to make sure it didn't leak, they filled it up with 6 inches of water and then gave the go-ahead. They figured if it didn't leak with 6 inches of water, why would it leak with 50 feet of molasses? Makes sense. But when 700,000 gallons were offloaded into the tank, it leaked a lot. Molasses began to ooze out of the places where the metal was riveted together, so much so that children would routinely collect the leaking molasses to bring home to their mothers, who, no doubt, were making brown bread. Now, as convenient as the leaking molasses was to the bakers of the North End, it was a little bit of an embarrassment to the Purity Distilling Company. So they emptied the tank, hired a competent engineer, and went to work at once to fix all of the leaks inside and out. No, I'm just kidding. They found some paint that was the exact color of the molasses that was leaking, and they painted the entire tank the same color so that nobody could see the leaks.
Nobody's gonna know. They're gonna know.
What they couldn't paint over were the moaning and creaking sounds that the tank made whenever it became close to full with hot, viscous molasses. Though in January of 1919, the molasses was not hot, but rather quite cold, as temperatures had hovered around zero for weeks. But on Wednesday, January 15th, the temperature in the city rose sharply overnight, reaching a balmy 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, what happened that day is all theory, and frankly, it could be a combination of different factors. One being that the steel at that low temperature could become quite brittle, something that the Titanic learned when it was in cold water. On top of that, a shipment of 600,000 gallons of molasses had recently been offloaded, and to make it less viscous and so easier to move, they heated the molasses. And when the heated molasses came into contact with the cold molasses, it began to ferment, causing carbon dioxide to release and pressure in the tank to build up. Then at 12:30 p.m. on January 15th, 1919, the first rivet shot out of the side of the tank, followed by another, and then another. After the first 2 or 3 rivets gave way, the others began giving way rapidly, resembling the barking of a rapid-fire machine gun. This was followed by a low rumbling sound as the tank of molasses burst. Persons walking along Commercial Street were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. An auto truck was picked up by the force of the air current, hurled several feet, and dropped at the opposite curbing, a mass of twisted wreckage. Then a 15-foot-high wall of hot molasses went rushing through the streets at 35 miles an hour, with such force that it knocked buildings off of their foundations and caused them to collapse. The tsunami carried cars, horses, people, and other debris for blocks. The wave smashed a 1-ton piece of steel into the trestle of the elevated train where, miraculously, a train had passed over only seconds before it collapsed. Men, women, and children were swamped by the wave and drowned in the molasses as it began to thicken in the cold air. Molasses, waist-deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled to form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. As it cooled, the molasses thickened, clogging people's noses and mouths so that most who died did so from suffocation. And when taken to hospitals, identifying them was nearly impossible through their syrupy cocoons. People came from all over to help those that were stuck in the molasses, but would often end up getting stuck in the quagmire themselves. Though many firefighters, Red Cross nurses, and sailors from nearby ships tried their best to pull people out, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. We saw this big cloud of brown dust and dirt and a slight noise, and there was an arm sticking out from underneath the wheel of a truck. So 2 of us got a hold of his arm and pulled, and unfortunately, we pulled his arm off. I did not see that coming. In total, 21 people died and 150 were seriously injured, and the cleanup took 6 long months. Those cleaning would often track molasses all over the city so that all of Boston ended up being just a little sticky. In the end, they used sand and fire hoses to push most of the molasses into Boston Harbor, sweetening any tea left over from the Boston Tea Party, I would think. But much of the molasses seemed uncleanable because even decades after the disaster, on warm days, Boston's North End would still smell of molasses. Now, it didn't take long before the finger-pointing began, and U.S. Industrial Alcohol, who had recently purchased the Purity Distilling Company, clung to the idea that it had been sabotage and not gross neglect that caused the disaster. But after years of litigation, it was determined that, as anyone who lived in the area knew, it had just been a shoddily made tank that was destined to collapse. In the end, U.S. Industrial Alcohol paid between $500,000 and $1 million to the city and to the families of the victims, which, even accounting for inflation, doesn't seem like that much, but the fact that they were held financially responsible at all was a huge step forward at that time. It also led to new building regulations and zoning laws that would prevent you from putting up a giant industrial building right next to people's houses. Now, something I found really interesting was that in the newspapers from the days after the disaster, right next to the articles about this Boston molasses flood, there are articles about another looming disaster. Because only 2 days after the tank burst, Nebraska cast the deciding vote to ratify the 18th Amendment, ushering in the era of Prohibition. So with no more rum being produced and fewer munitions being necessary now that World War I was over, molasses was really only good for one thing: making Boston brown bread. So once your bread has been thoroughly steamed, you can take it out of the pot. And I find that these canning tongs are very helpful in this situation, and they're just so cool. It's like the claw. So I'll put a link in the description to where you can get these. Then open the can and let the bread cool for 20 minutes before removing the loaf. It should slide right out, and then slice and serve with a bit of salted butter. And here we are, Fannie Farmer's Boston brown bread. So some old recipes actually have you put the loaf in the oven for a few minutes to like make a crust around it, but Fannie Farmer does not, so I am not. So I'm just gonna eat it as she says. It smells so good. The rye is actually what comes through almost as much as the molasses. I don't know, let's give it a try. So I can see why people add sugar today, because I had expected it to be sweet. I've never had it. It's not sweet. I mean, there's like that hint of sweetness that you get from molasses, but there's also that bitterness from molasses. But really what you're getting is the rye. That's the flavor that is coming through, and it's just like tempered by the molasses. But then you get a little bit of like that cornbread too from the corn. Also the texture. The texture is what makes this so special. It's soft and spongy and moist and yet pretty dense. Again, she uses a lot less baking soda. In fact, I would not only use more baking soda, but I would also throw in a little bit of baking powder, because with the very long cook time, the baking soda is going to get used up at the beginning, whereas the baking powder will kind of last a little bit longer. Now, if for some reason you don't want to make this, which you should, but if for some reason you don't want to, you can actually buy brown bread in a can. But I encourage you to make it as Fannie Farmer did, or one of the more modern recipes, that's fine too. Like I said, they're all very, very similar. Make sure to follow me over on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History. I'm gonna eat this bread because it's really, really delicious, and I think it's gonna just grow on me even more.